Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the inaugural Semafor World Economic Summit. Please welcome Semafor Editor-at-Large, Steve Clemens, to guide a conversation on surviving megathreats.
Please join us, Nouriel Roubini. Nouriel Roubini is Professor Emeritus of Economics, the Stern School of Business, NYU, and he's CEO of Roubini Macro Associates. But more importantly, he's author of one of the most important books I have read in a couple of years, titled Megathreats and How to Survive Them. It's got a sensational title, but I would say, Nouriel, you're known pejoratively kind of as Dr. Doom. When I read this and I took the notion off that this was you and the way people had framed you, I found it to be an incredibly realistic assessment. You yourself say in the book, I want to be known as Dr. Realist. Yeah. Why don't you lay out for us the interconnectedness of challenges that you think policymakers have their head in the sand on?
Yes, as I was writing the book, I realized that in addition to traditional and new economic, monetary, and financial risks, there are political, there are geopolitical, there are environmental, there are health, there are social, there are technological, and they're all interconnected with each other. It's like a 10 by 10 matrix in which each one of these threats affects the other and vice versa. Now, I call them mega threats, but the Financial Times chose as one of the words of the year the term polycrisis. The Collins Dictionary has also chosen as one of the words of the year. I was at the IMF in December presenting the book in front of the IMF MD, Kristalina Georgieva. She spoke about confluence of calamities that we have not seen since World War II. The head of the ECB, Christine Lagarde, has spoken about the perma-crisis. And I was in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and the entire global risk report was about polycrisis and mega threats. So whether you're calling it mega threats or polycrisis or a confluence of calamities or a perma-crisis, we're talking about the same sets of things.
Whenever I see you, you have a countenance that looks worried. When I see Christine Lagarde, when I see Director Georgieva, they kind of look happy. So are they, do they have a let them eat cake attitude? Are they going to say, hey, I'm going to be fine, but the world's going to be screwed? I mean, you worry about the world.
No, I worry about the world, and I don't smile when I talk about it. Other people speak about the confluence of calamities or a perma-crisis, and they smile. So I think that's the only difference. But I think that, I'm not speaking in the book about aliens taking over the planet or about asteroids hitting the planet. These are all threats that exist. There are hundreds of books about climate change, about the risk of a geopolitical World War III, about health and pandemics, about threats to democracy. What I do in the book is try to connect the dots between all these different ones. And the nature, by the way, of the economic, monetary, and financial risk has changed even in the last 3 years. I mean, 3 years ago, we were worried about deflation and lowflation. Now we worry about inflation. 3 years ago, we were worried, like Larry Summers, about secular stagnation, the idea there was too much savings, not enough demand, deflation. Now we have to worry about secular stagflation, recession, and inflation. 2 years ago, we were worried that interest rates were too low. Now, with interest rates rising and very high debt ratio, we are worried about debts becoming unsustainable. We were worried about the perils of hyper-globalization. Now we have to worry about deglobalization, protectionism, and friendshoring, and fragmentation of the global economy. We had the everything bubble. Now we have an everything bust. We went from a boom and a bubble to a bust and a crash. And we're saying interest rates were too low, now they're rising. People realize as yields are higher, the price of bonds is lower. So there are $620 billion of losses on the balance sheets of banks and trillions more on anybody's holding long duration fixed income in the US. So even the nature of what are the economic, monetary, and financial threats are very different today than were even 3 years ago. So it's a very different world.
Well, let me just tick through some of these because you analyze, I think, in beautiful detail, it's a beautifully written book, the debt crisis and how to deal with it. And that debt crisis, you argue, then leads to an inability to do certain other things, like remediation for climate. You basically say we're already there in climate change. There are too many forces that have been unleashed. Now, how do you pay for remediation? You have the demographic time bomb, right? You have that combined with sort of hostility to immigration. we had Tharman, the senior minister of Singapore, on here, really, basically agreeing with you earlier that the easy money dimensions of what went on, particularly in the U.S. economy, but not only here, really did it. You look at the way currency traps the reserve currency status of the dollar. You have to understand, he wrote this before the attack on the reserve. I mean, everything he wrote about a year ago, and when you read it, you're saying, damn, things are just kind of going the way he had. Talked about AI threat, the U.S.-China competition, and the invasion of Ukraine, in which you were so prescient about. So when you kind of look at these dimensions, because you say policymakers could make a difference if they align. You doubt they will. But how would you sequence an approach to dealing with these?
Well, there are short-term threats that are, in my view, inflation being still too high, the risk of recession, and very high private and public debt ratios as a share of GDP. And the way I put it is that central banks and policymakers are not facing just a dilemma, they're facing a trilemma. Until recently, the problem was how you maintain growth and avoid a recession when inflation is too high. If you raise rates, you risk causing a hard landing. If you care about jobs, you don't raise them enough, then the risk is of the anchor of inflation. But now there's a third layer that I discuss in the book. In a world in which there is too much private and public debt, as you raise interest rates to fight inflation, and you want also financial stability on top of growth stability, you risk financial instability. It takes two dimensions. One, the burdens of financing these debts for those who have high debts, household, corporates, businesses, banks, government, countries, becomes unsustainable. And two, as long rates go higher, the value of long-term duration security is lower, so there are massive losses even for the creditors. So we have price stability, economic stability, and financial stability to be achieved, and we have only one instrument, that is policy rates, which is becoming mission impossible. So them if you do and them if you don't. Central banks fight inflation, they're going to cause a hard landing, they're going to cause a financial crisis that makes the recession more severe. And if instead they care about financial stability and growth, and they don't fight inflation, they're behind the curve, and like the 70s, inflation expectation get de-anchored, price-wage spiral, and we end up still with inflation, with recession, and with a financial crisis down the line.
And
so we're stuck.
And what you connect this to is politics.
Yeah.
If you look at the rise of populism in the world, and you say, for the measures that could be taken, the stress of those measures, the impact on the political environment and lives could lead to significant rise in populist outcomes that actually undoes much of the investment on dealing with things like climate or debt or other things. So can you explain that loop for us?
Well, there has been, first of all, a rise in income and wealth inequality. There's a malaise of the middle class. There are lots of people who are left behind with their trade, technology, and you name it, power of the elites. The young people feel like they're going to be worse off than their parents. And the political manifestation of all these economic malaise is a backlash against liberal democracy, against democratic capitalism, and you're seeing radical extremist populist party with extreme right or extreme left mostly these days in Latin America, that are coming to power. I mean, you have Putin in Russia, you have Erdogan in Turkey, you have Orban, in Hungary, just to give you a few examples. You had the Brexit phenomenon, you have Meloni in Italy, you have the Trump phenomenon, could happen again. And therefore, we are seeing a backlash against liberal democracy. The trouble is with populism that eventually leads to economic and financial disaster. So it's not the solution. And actually, the biggest authoritarian in the world, of course, is Xi Jinping. I don't know whether authoritarian or the right or the left. And that's becoming also a danger.
You write in there something I didn't know about you, that you were a staff member. I mean, hard to imagine you being a staff member for anyone, but you were a staff member at the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House. We'll have Heather Boushey here later, who's member of the council now. We'll have Jason Furman, who is 28th chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Yeah. But it sounds to me like that moment when you were there, was it the early 80s?
No, I was there in 98, actually.
Okay,
yeah,
so when you were there,
during the Asian financial crisis.
You were launching some bombs. You were raising some concerns about the future of the economy then. Do you think that the structure of the government and economic policymakers, that are advising the federal government, advising the president, is structured well enough? Or have we become so has the draw to political correctness made us pull our punches on a lot of these key issues?
Well, I think there have been many economic policy mistakes because we've had this build-up of private and public debt. It used to be globally 100% of GDP in the 70s, today 420 and rising in advanced economies. And part of it there has been that, whenever...
Say that again, say those numbers.
From 100% of GDP to 420 in advanced economies. And until recently, that ratio were high, but that servicing ratio were low because we had zero policy rates, negative policy rates, quantitative easing, credit easing, long-term rates were low, if not negative, like in Europe. So that servicing ratio were low, but now the inflation is rising, these debts are becoming unsustainable. That's why I talk about the model of a debt crisis. And it's not just private debt, household, corporates, banks. It's not just official public debt. We have about 100% of GDP of unfunded liability coming from aging of population, pay-as-you-go, social security, and healthcare system. So that's another time bomb. And I think we've had this build-up of that because every time there is a asset and credit bubble, central banks are not doing anything about it. And when it goes bust into a crash, they say, okay, we have to backstop the system. Otherwise, if Wall Street collapses, it hurts Main Street. And then there is another cycle of building leverage in the private and public sector. So we have the ratcheting up of private and public debt to a point that's now becoming unsustainable. And even this time around, once we have financial stability, we feel like we have to backstop the banks. But you're creating moral hazard that leads to even more cycles of debt and leverage over time. And eventually, it's unsustainable.
So what are the positive shocks and the negative shocks as you see them of AI?
Well, the positive of AI is, in principle, is going to lead to an increase in productivity growth, an increase in potential growth, even if in the aggregate productivity number and growth numbers, we're not yet seeing it. Probably it's going to take time, but we're going to see it. The negative of AI is that we're going to go in a world where there is permanent technological unemployment. First is blue-collar jobs, automation, robotics in the factories, but now even cognitive jobs that are white-collar can be sliced in a series of tasks can be automated. And down the line, even creative jobs, the one of an economist, the one of a journalist, the one of computer programmers, gradually could be replaced by AI. So we could have massive technological employment. Secondly, AI is going to increase an already high income and wealth inequality because it's capital intensive, skill bias, and labor saving. So if you own the machines or the capitals of the machine, you're going to do well. If you're in the top 10% distribution of skills, education, human capital, like I'm sure everybody in this crowd, probably for a while, AI is going to make you more productive. But if you're a low value added or medium value added, blue collar, white collar, increasing your job and income is going to be threatened by technology. And the final dark side of technology is that traditionally technological innovations are driven by government want to build bigger weapons to fight bigger wars. We had the first industrial revolution, we're the first era of globalization. Not only did not prevent World War I, but actually we built the weapons like the tanks that allowed us to fight World War I. Same thing with World War II. Before we had nuclear power, we had nuclear bombs. The internet was invented by DARPA. The Boeing 747 was a military project. And Israel, the startup nation, is initially military application that become civilian. And this time around, the fight on who's going to be controlling AI, whether it's China or the US, is not only a fight on who's going to be controlling the firms and the institutes of the future, it's also who's going to be the leading political, military, and security power of the world. That's why last year, Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, and Henry Kissinger, our foremost geostrategist, wrote this book together, said the fight on AI is also on whether China or US are going to be the greatest military superpower. And the war in Ukraine is an example of how you can use AI, satellites, machine learning, and data to fight a war. It's the beginning of this cyber war.
We've been talking about AI all day in a lot of these geopolitical conversations, which are going to continue to be part of our discussion today. But just in the last few weeks, we saw former Ambassador Qin Gang, now Foreign Minister of China, negotiate a truce, a rapprochement, if you will, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We saw a shift in the currency baskets used to finance energy payments, which people have said, wow, that's an attack on the reserve currency status of the dollar, something you write about. And thirdly, we saw President Macron France, go to Beijing and say, we're not allied on America on everything. We don't see Taiwan the same way. How big a shock in the Richter scale of geostrategic affairs are these three episodes?
Well, they are symptomatic of two aspects that are important, two factors. One is that we are in a geopolitical depression, and you have a number of revisionist power who challenge the economic, monetary, financial, political, and geopolitical order that US, Europe, and the West created after World War II. Is China, is Russia, is North Korea, is Iran, is Pakistan, but increasingly also their own friends and allies. We already have a hot war in Ukraine, brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, could become unconventional, could become involving NATO. I was recently in Israel, where Israel realizes that Iran is becoming effectively a threshold nuclear state. They'll have to make a tough decision. Them if you do, them if you don't, whether to attack Iran. If that happens, it'll be a shock to oil prices higher.
They're going to do it, right?
I don't know. There are pros and cons. Some people believe you can live with deterrence. The problem with deterrence is that once Iran has the bomb, the next year Saudi buy a couple of them from Pakistan. Turkey and Egypt want to have one, and they build it. And in 5 years, you have half a dozen unstable countries in the Middle East all having the bomb. And that's dangerous for not only Israel, for Europe, even for the United States. But then attacking Iran is going to imply a shock to oil prices worse than 73 and 79. It could happen. I think it's a risk to the market underpricing. And I was just in China, where realistically this Cold War between US and China is becoming colder by the day. And people are already talking about scenarios of how you war game Taiwan and so on. So we live in this world. And then the financial aspect of it, point out to you, is that Chinese realize if I owe you $1 billion is my problem, if I owe you $1 trillion is my problem. And they want to diversify from dollar assets, and they're building international monetary reserve regime where unit of account, means of payment, store of value is going to be based on the yuan.
If you were going to write this book for China in mind about megathreat, what would be the megathreats facing China? And I should tell you, I mentioned the Mobile World Congress earlier. I visited Huawei. Huawei had a huge one of the giant pavilions there. There were 7 of them. They had a whole pavilion there. They seem to be doing just fine. And so when I look at it, are we deluding ourselves about the impact we're having on China's growth in vector? And with Russia drawn down in Ukraine, U.S. and the West drawn into Ukraine, is China just doing fine?
No, they're not doing fine. There are strengths and there are weaknesses. It's going to become one of the largest economies in the world. But
do they have bigger mega threats than we do?
The mega threats, many of the global ones, affect them as much as affect us. Climate change, the risk of war among great nations, pandemics, AI, and political instability, you name it. We live in a world in which many of these factors are global. They're not just individual. Economic and financial security. And they're facing challenges. The population of China is going to fall in generation from 1.4 billion to 700. They have a huge amount of debt. They have a real estate problem. They've become more state capitalism and therefore less innovation by the private sector. They're becoming more authoritarian. They're becoming more aggressive. When all the power is in one individual, so we put in, you can make mistakes, like he did on zero COVID policy, Xi Jinping, or lurching to a war with Taiwan. And that's another risk as well. So we live in a dangerous world.
I like, there are 2 things about the end of your book that I really enjoy. Is one, the parts about optimism and what you're optimistic about is about 3 pages, if I remember right.
6.
So, 6 pages, that kind of 10.
No, but in each chapter there is also a solution.
I think the font was big. Very, very short. And you also kind of go into what should you buy and invest in when you were going to advise it. You said gold is one of those, which I hadn't heard for a while. But what, as you kind of look at, not that we're proud of investors, but you are talking about finance. But what do you think? How do you protect wealth in these kinds of times?
Well, traditional defensive assets is long-term treasuries, because it's 60-40, risk on, risk off, growth, recession. When equity do poorly, bonds yields go down, price goes higher. But last year, bond prices fell when equity prices fell, and bond prices fell more than equity because yields were going higher. So that diversification benefit didn't occur, because when inflation is rising, you lose money on bonds, you lose money on equities. That's why you need short-term treasuries, you need TIPS and inflation-index bonds, you need gold and precious metals, and maybe green metals, and maybe sustainable forms of real estate. Those are the new defensive assets in a world of high inflation, debasement of fiat currency, geopolitical conflict, social instability, and risk of de-dollarization. Those are kind of things you have to think about. as an investor.
As
Yep.
you work through the town this week, because I know you're speaking to a lot of different conferences and you've been invited because you're the great Nouriel Roubini. How are people hearing your message? Are they taking it seriously, or are they looking at this as a joke?
No, they're taking it seriously because, as I said, whether you're calling it polycrisis or confluence of calamity or PERMA, I'm talking about stuff that each and one of us recognize being there. We can agree or disagree on how short-term and long-term threats, slow motion, fast motion, whether the solutions are feasible or not feasible. But as I said, I'm talking about threats that everybody recognizes, and what I did in the book, trying to connect them with each other and think of them as a system. And you cannot resolve them individually to resolve the entire system. That's why it's harder at the national level. It's even harder in a geopolitical conflict to reach cooperation at the global level, because these problems are global. Climate change, economic security, financial security, health, global military security. These are things you cannot resolve only individually. At the national level, it's hard enough to find consensus at home, let alone at the global level, in a world that is divided. That's the risk we're facing.
You know, Laura Tyson is in the room. I'm going to be talking to her later, and she's very readable. I'll say there are not many economists that are readable. And I want to say this was a beautifully written, beautifully crafted, important book. I want to thank you, Nouriel Roubini, author of Megathreats and How to Survive Them. Wonderful conversation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you all.